Sun-jun Kwan wasn't a man you negotiated with. He was the phantom of the underworld tailored in Italian wool, the dragon whose slightest nod could erase entire families. But his nightmare wasn't the relentless police investigators or the bloodshed staining the streets of Seoul. It was the toddler in the soft pink dress who sat like a porcelain doll and refused to connect with a single living soul. Doctors called it severe emotional detachment, a defect from birth. But Sun-jun called it the price of his sins. That hollow silence reigned for 2 years, until a rainy Tuesday night at the Onyx Room. When the most dangerous man in the city felt his world fracture, his daughter didn't just move, she came alive. She stretched her small arms toward a woman trying desperately to remain invisible, Thandiwe, a waitress who had no idea her life was about to be dismantled. And the child screamed the one word that would eventually burn the Geum-Ryong syndicate to the ground. Mommy. The Onyx Room wasn't just a dining hall. It was a fortress of influence, a members-only sanctuary buried in the city's heart where billionaires dined with butchers, and silence was the most expensive item on the menu. The amber lights were dim by design, hiding sins in the corners. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of money and fear. Thandiwe smoothed her white apron in the shadows, her hand steady but her heart pounding. She was invisible to the elite diners, a ghost in a uniform. But as she approached the center table with a bottle of vintage red, she wasn't just pouring wine. She was walking into the crosshairs of a man who didn't believe in coincidences. But why did a child who hasn't spoken in 2 years choose a stranger? The answer is darker than you think. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a second of the truth, and comment the dragon if you're ready to see this syndicate fall. Now, let's enter the interrogation room. The silence in the penthouse office was heavier than the chaos of the restaurant floor. Thandiwe sat on the edge of a leather chair that felt less like furniture and more like a trap, her hands gripping her knees to stop them from trembling. The room smelled of cedar and cold, filtered air, the scent of power that didn't need to raise its voice. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Seoul skyline bled neon into the rain, but inside, the air was thin enough to choke on. She hadn't said a word since the men in black suits had escorted her from the Onyx Room, their hands firm on her elbows, guiding her past the stunned diners. Now, the only sound was the rhythmic tap of a heavy gold ring against a mahogany desk. Sun-jun Kwan stood by the window, his back to her. The city lights cast his silhouette in sharp relief, outlining the rigid set of his shoulders. When he finally turned, the movement was liquid, predatory. He didn't look like a man who had just witnessed a miracle, he looked like a man deciding how to dispose of a problem. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe as he tilted his head, his eyes dark voids that absorbed the light. Who do you work for? His voice was low, a velvet-wrapped blade. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. I'm a waitress, Thandiwe whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of his stare. She cleared her throat, forcing strength into her tone. I work for the restaurant. I pour wine. That's it. Sun-jun stepped closer, closing the distance until he loomed over her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. My daughter has not spoken in 2 years. Not to doctors. Not to nannies. Not to me. He placed both hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her. Thandiwe pressed herself back against the leather, her breath hitching. Tonight, she saw you. A stranger. And she called you mother. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could see the faint scars near his temple, the exhaustion buried deep beneath the rage. Children do not lie, Miss Thandiwe. But adults do. So I will ask you once more before I let my security team take over. His hand moved, brushing a stray curl away from her face, a gesture that was terrifyingly gentle. Why does my daughter know you? I don't know. The words tore out of her, desperate and raw. I've never seen her before. I swear on my life, I've never seen her. Sun-jun studied her face, searching for the tremor of a lie. He saw only terror and a confusion that mirrored his own. He straightened slowly, the violence in his eyes cooling into something far more dangerous, calculation. "Then we have a problem," he said softly. "Because she is still screaming for you." "I'm not who you think I am," Thandiwe said, her voice shaking but gaining a desperate edge. She pulled her black cardigan tighter around her chest, as if the fabric could shield her from the man stripping her secrets away with just a look. "I'm nobody. I serve tables. I go home. That's my life." Sun-jun didn't move. He stood like a statue carved from obsidian, his stillness more threatening than any weapon. "My daughter recognized you," he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "A child who sees no one saw you. That makes you someone." "Maybe I just look like her mother," Thandiwe offered weakly, though the word tasted like ash. "Her mother is dead," Sun-jun corrected, his voice devoid of warmth. "She died in a fire 2 years ago. Unless you are a ghost, that is not the reason." Thandiwe looked down at her hands, the rough skin of her palms a map of hard labor. "I don't know what you want me to say. I haven't been near a child in 2 years. Not since." She trailed off, the memory clawing at her throat. Sun-jun caught the hesitation. He stepped closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain invading her space. "Since when?" "Since I lost mine," she whispered. The admission hung in the air, fragile and sharp. "I was a surrogate. 2 years ago. I needed the money, my student loans, my rent, it was all drowning me." She looked up, her brown eyes wet but fierce. "I signed a contract with a clinic. An anonymous couple. They paid for everything, and I carried their baby." Sun-jun's expression didn't shift, but his fingers twitched at his side. And she died," Thandiwe choked out. "During the C-section. The doctors said there were complications. They told me she was stillborn. I never even got to hold her." "A tragic story," Sun-jun said, his tone icy with skepticism. "But stories are easy to fabricate." "It's not a story." Thandiwe stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Driven by a sudden, frantic need to be believed, to prove she wasn't a monster or a spy, she reached for the hem of her waitress uniform. Her hands trembled as she lifted the fabric just enough to expose her lower abdomen. The scar was jagged, a thick, raised keloid line that marred her deep brown skin. It wasn't the clean, thin incision of a careful surgeon, it looked hasty, brutal, a wound that had healed without kindness. "They cut me open," she said, her voice trembling. "They took the baby, told me she was dead, and sent me out the back door with a check." Sun-jun stared at the scar. For a moment, the mask of the dragon slipped, revealing a flicker of something human, distaste, perhaps, or recognition of pain. He looked from the ugly mark on her skin to her face. "What was the name of this clinic?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Thandiwe dropped her shirt, feeling suddenly cold. "They called it the Foundation. It was in Gangnam." The color drained from Sun-jun's face. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. He knew that name. It was the same exclusive, shadow-funded facility his late wife had visited for her fertility treatments. The same place that had handed him a daughter he thought was his miracle. Sun-jun left Thandiwe under the watch of his silent sentinels and descended into the vault beneath the penthouse. The air here was recycled and stale, preserved like a tomb. He didn't need a key, the biometric scanner read the unique topography of his retina and the rhythmic thud of his pulse, granting him access to the sins of the Geum-Ryong syndicate. But tonight, he wasn't looking for blackmail on politicians or routes for smuggling rings. He was looking for his wife. Min-ji had been dead for 2 years, taken by an aneurysm that struck with the same sudden violence as the fire that had supposedly traumatized their daughter. Sun-jun had mourned her, respected her, and raised the child she had gifted him. He had never questioned the miracle of Christabel's birth, even when Minji had insisted on a private, secluded confinement abroad. He pulled the heavy steel drawer open. Inside lay a single red folder embossed with the gold insignia of the Foundation. His hands, usually steady enough to pull a trigger between heartbeats, felt heavy as he flipped the cover. The document smelled of old paper and betrayal. He scanned the dates. Minji's fertility treatments had failed months before she claimed to be pregnant. The medical notes were clinical and damning: uterus incapable of gestation. Adoption recommended. He turned the page, his eyes narrowing. There was a subfile labeled Priority Acquisition. The timeline was a perfect, damning overlap. 2 years ago. March 14th. The date Thandiwe had been cut open. The date Minji had called him, weeping with joy, to say their daughter had arrived early. Sun-jun's finger traced the line item, surrogate number 894. Thandiwe Baker. Status, emergency C-section. And below it, 2 conflicting documents stapled together. The first was a death certificate for baby girl Baker, citing respiratory failure, signed by a doctor Sun-jun knew was on his own payroll. The second was a transfer of custody form, moving subject C from the surgical wing to the private suite of Mrs. Minji Kwan. The air in the vault seemed to vanish. Sun-jun gripped the edge of the steel table, his knuckles turning white. It wasn't just a lie, it was a theft. Minji hadn't just used a donor or adopted a waiting orphan. She had commissioned a child from a desperate woman, harvested it like an organ, and then erased the mother's existence with a pen stroke and a falsified grave. The impurity his cousin Taewik whispered about with such venom wasn't just mixed heritage. It was the truth of the crime the syndicate was built on. Christabel wasn't a porcelain doll broken by a fire. She was a child mourning a mother she had been ripped from moments after taking her first breath. Sun-jun closed the file. The rage that filled him was cold, absolute, and terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just the father of a stolen child. He was the husband of the kidnapper. And the woman upstairs, terrified and shaking in his office, was the only innocent thing in his entire wretched world. Sun-jun returned to the office not as an interrogator, but as a man walking to his own execution. He didn't speak when he unlocked the door. He simply gestured for Thandiwe to stand. "Come," he said. The single syllable was brittle, lacking its usual command. Thandiwe hesitated, her legs stiff from fear. "Where are you taking me?" Am I going home?" "You are going to see her," Sun-jun replied, opening the door. He didn't wait for her protest. He walked into the corridor, and she had no choice but to follow, trailing him through the labyrinth of the penthouse. The hallway was a gallery of cold wealth, marble floors, abstract art that cost more than her life's earnings, and silence. Always the silence. They reached a set of double doors at the end of the east wing. Sun-jun paused, his hand hovering over the handle. He looked at Thandiwe, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "She has not slept," he said quietly. "She is pacing. She is, waiting." He pushed the doors open. The nursery was vast, painted in soft creams and filled with toys that looked untouched. In the center of the room, standing by a window that overlooked the city she was too small to understand, was Christabel. The toddler was rocking back and forth on her heels, clutching the hem of her pink dress, a low, keening sound escaping her throat. It was the sound of a wounded animal. Thandiwe's heart slammed against her ribs. The fear of the Mafia boss, the gun, the interrogation, it all evaporated the moment she saw the child's distress. It was a visceral pull, a hook in her gut reeling her in. "Hey," Thandiwe whispered, stepping past Sun-jun without asking permission. "Hey, little one." Christabel froze. She turned slowly, her tear-streaked face twisting with disbelief. When her eyes locked on Thandiwe, the keening stopped instantly. The silence that followed wasn't the hollow, dead silence Sun-jun was used to. It was the silence of a held breath, of anticipation. Christabel took a shaky step forward. Thandiwe dropped to her knees, opening her arms instinctively, not knowing why, only knowing that she had to caught this child. "Mommy!" Christabel launched herself across the room. She collided with Thandiwe, burying her face in the crook of the waitress's neck, her tiny hands gripping Thandiwe's uniform with a strength that defied her size. Thandiwe gasped, the impact knocking the wind out of her. But she didn't pull away. She wrapped her arms around the small, trembling body, and a jolt of electricity tore through her. The scent of the child, milk, lavender, and tears, hit her like a memory she hadn't known she'd lost. Her body remembered this weight. Her arms remembered this shape. "It's okay," Thandiwe murmured, rocking her, tears she couldn't explain spilling onto her cheeks. "I've got you. I'm here." Sun-jun watched from the doorway, his hand gripping the frame until his knuckles turned white. He watched the way his daughter's shoulders dropped, the tension draining out of her as if a spell had been broken. He watched Thandiwe hold a child she thought was a stranger, and look complete for the first time since walking into his office. He didn't need the lab results. The science was slow, this was immediate. The theft was undeniable. The mother had found her child. "You cannot leave." The words severed the warmth of the moment like a guillotine. Thandiwe stiffened, Christabel still clinging to her neck like a lifeline, her small breasts hitching in sleep. Sun-jun walked fully into the room, the soft nursery lights casting long, sharp shadows against the cream walls that seemed to stretch for miles. "What?" Thandiwe asked, her voice barely a whisper, clutching the child tighter. "You are a loose end, Miss Baker," Sun-jun stated. His voice was devoid of the earlier aggression but filled with a terrifying pragmatism that was somehow worse. "My daughter has identified you as her mother. You have entered my home. You have seen the weakness in my armor." He stopped a few feet away, his presence overwhelming the pastel room. "In my world, people who know this much simply disappear." Thandiwe's blood ran cold. She looked at the open door, measuring the distance, calculating odds she knew were zero. "Are you going to kill me?" "I should," Sun-jun admitted, and the casual way he said it made her stomach turn. "Strategically, it is the only sound option. But if I remove you, she breaks." He gestured to Christabel, who was now dead weight on Thandiwe's shoulder, exhausted by the emotional release. "And if she breaks, I have nothing." He clasped his hands behind his back, the dragon tattoo peeking above his collar like a warning. "So, I am offering you a contract." "A contract?" "You will live here," he said, listing the terms as if he were buying a building. "In this house. You will be her nanny, her guardian, her, whatever she needs you to be. You will not leave the estate without my guard. You will not speak to your former employers. You will vanish from your old life." "That's not a job," Thandiwe snapped, keeping her voice low to avoid waking the child. "That's prison." "It is protection," Sun-jun corrected, his eyes hard. "My enemies are circling. If they find out about her attachment to you, they will use you to get to me. Out there, you are a target. Here, you are under the protection of the Geum-Ryong. No one touches what is mine." He pulled a folded check from his jacket pocket. He hadn't written it, but Thandiwe knew it represented more money than she would see in 10 lifetimes. He placed it on the changing table. "Your debts, your loans, your rent, all paid. You live in luxury. You are safe. And in exchange, you fix her." He looked at his daughter, his expression cracking with a rare, raw desperation. "She needs you. And God help me, I cannot save her alone." Thandiwe looked down at the sleeping girl, the girl who felt so impossibly familiar, whose heartbeat seemed to sync with her own. Leaving meant freedom, but it meant abandoning this child to a cold, silent tower with a father who spoke in death warrants. "I don't want your money," Thandiwe whispered, though she knew she needed it. She smoothed Christabel's hair, her hand trembling. But I won't leave her. Sun-jun nodded once, the deal struck in the quiet of the nursery. Then welcome home, Miss Baker. Life in the penthouse was like living inside a diamond, cold, beautiful, and hard enough to cut you. Thandiwe walked through hallways lined with Ming vases and abstract sculptures, her cheap sneakers squeaking against marble floors that cost more than her childhood home. Every door was guarded by a man in a black suit who looked through her as if she were a ghost, or worse, an intruder they were waiting for permission to remove. The violence here wasn't loud, it was whispered. It was in the way the staff vanished when Sun-jun entered a room, or the way a phone call in the study ended with a distinct, final click that signaled someone's ruin. Thandiwe tried to ignore the gun holsters bulging beneath the guards' jackets, focusing instead on the little girl trailing her like a shadow. Christabel was still quiet, but she was no longer frozen. She watched Thandiwe with wide, hungry eyes, waiting for cues on how to exist. This house is too quiet, Thandiwe muttered on the third day. She looked at the formal living room, a pristine expanse of white leather and glass tables. It's like a museum for people who don't touch things. Christabel looked up, clutching her doll. No touch, she whispered, her voice rusty. Thandiwe knelt, a mischievous spark lighting her eyes. No, baby. We're going to touch everything. She grabbed a throw pillow made of hand-woven silk. Then another. She stripped the pristine white sofa of its cushions, tossing them onto the floor. Christabel gasped, looking toward the door as if expecting the police. We need a fort, Thandiwe announced. A big one. They draped cashmere blankets over the coffee table. They piled pillows into a barricade. For an hour, the impeccable living room was transformed into a chaotic sanctuary of soft fabric and giggles. When the structure collapsed on top of them, Thandiwe let out a loud, belly-deep laugh, tickling Christabel's sides until the child shrieked, a high, bright sound that shattered the penthouse's oppressive silence. The door opened. The laughter died instantly. Sun-jun stood in the archway, flanked by his second-in-command, the Viper. The dragon looked tired, his knuckles bruised, carrying the metallic scent of fresh violence from the streets below. He stared at the destruction of his living room, the overturned cushions, the tangled blankets, the chaos. The Viper sneered. I will call the cleaners to remove this mess. No, Sun-jun said, raising a hand. His eyes weren't on the mess, they were on Christabel, who was smiling. Actually smiling. He stepped into the room, the heavy atmosphere of the syndicate clinging to his suit. He looked like a storm cloud entering a nursery. He crouched down by the opening of the blanket fort, his sharp features softening in disbelief. What is this? He asked, his voice losing its command. It's a castle, Christabel chirped, emboldened by Thandiwe's presence. For safekeeping. Thandiwe, hair messy and eyes defiant, looked at the Mafia boss. There's room for one more, she challenged softly. If you take off the shoes. Sun-jun hesitated. The Viper scoffed behind him, but Sun-jun ignored it. Slowly, deliberately, the most feared man in Seoul kicked off his Italian loafers. He crawled into the small, dark space of the fort, sitting awkwardly on a silk cushion. In the dim light of the blankets, staring at the woman and child who looked like a matching set, the dragon let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. And when Christabel handed him a pillow, he didn't check it for threats. He just held it, and for the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. News in the underworld traveled faster than bullet trains and struck with twice the force. It didn't move through official channels or board meetings, it drifted through the smoke of backroom poker games and settled in the dregs of whiskey glasses at the Onyx Room. The dragon has lost his teeth. The whisper started low, a vibration in the foundation of the Geum-Ryong syndicate. It spoke of a house transformed, of a leader who no longer spent his nights enforcing territory lines but instead sat on the floor of his penthouse, building castles out of silk cushions with a foreign woman. In the VIP lounge of the Red Lotus Club, the air was thick with expensive cigar smoke and treason. 3 capos sat around a low table, their faces obscured by shadow. But leaning against the wall, swirling a glass of amber liquid, was the Viper. Min-ho, known as the Viper for his strike speed and lack of conscience, watched the men with cold amusement. He had served Sun-jun for a decade. He had respected the brutality, the efficiency, the absolute order. But what he had seen in the penthouse, the shoes kicked off, the softness in the dragon's eyes, made his stomach turn. "They say she lives in the East Wing," one of the capos muttered, flicking ash onto the floor. "The help. The outsider." "She isn't help," another corrected, his voice laced with disgust. "She eats at his table. He listens to her. And the girl screams for her like she is blood." The Viper stepped out of the shadows. The conversation died instantly. He placed his glass on the table with a sharp clink. "The girl is broken," the Viper stated, his voice smooth and venomous. "And now, she has infected the father." He walked around the table, his hand resting briefly on the shoulder of the youngest capo, a silent reminder of who held the real leash now that the master was distracted. Sun-jun Kwan built this empire on fear. On purity of will. Now he invites a stranger, a woman with no name, no lineage, no standing, into the heart of our operations. He lets her handle the air. He lets her soften his hands. "He is still the dragon," the older man warned, though his eyes darted nervously to the door. "Is he?" The Viper leaned down, his face illuminated by the flicker of a lighter. "A dragon does not play house. A dragon burns. Sun-jun is extinguishing his own fire to keep a waitress warm." He straightened, buttoning his jacket. The decision had been made the moment he saw Sun-jun crawling into that ridiculous blanket fort. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was a death sentence for the syndicate. Weakness invited wolves. If Sun-jun wouldn't protect the legacy of the Geum-Ryong, the Viper would. "We do not betray him," the Viper said, lying with the ease of a politician. "We save the syndicate from his madness. We cut out the rot before it spreads." "And the woman?" The Viper smiled, and it was a terrifying thing. "The woman is the disease. And you know what we do with infections." He crushed the ember of his cigar into the crystal ashtray. "We burn them out." The conference room in the city center was a cage of glass and steel, suspended 40 stories above the streets where Thandiwe used to be invisible. Now, she was the center of attention for 3 of the most expensive attorneys in Seoul, men who looked at her not as a mother, but as a complex liability equation. "It is not a matter of biology, Miss Baker," the lead attorney, Mr. Chai, said. He slid a thick dossier across the polished table. "It is a matter of documentation. And the documentation is ironclad." Thandiwe didn't touch the file. She kept her hands clasped on her lap, white-knuckled. "The documentation is a lie. You know that. Sun-jun knows that." She glanced at the dragon, who sat at the head of the table, silent and unreadable, watching the lawyers with the detached intensity of an executioner. "I was defrauded. My child was stolen." "Prove it," Chai challenged softly, not with malice, but with cold legal reality. "The Foundation destroyed the original records. The birth certificate lists Min-ji Kwan as the biological mother. The death certificate for your child is filed with the state. In the eyes of the law, your daughter died 2 years ago. The girl living in Mr. Kwan's home is his legal heir." "Then we do a DNA test," Thandiwe insisted. "We go to a judge. And trigger an international investigation?" Chai removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "If you file for custody, you expose the fraud. The state will intervene immediately. They will remove the child from Mr. Kwan's home and place her in protective custody, an orphanage, while the investigation drags on for years. You will be deported or arrested for participation in an illegal surrogacy ring. Mr. Kwan will face charges for human trafficking. The room went silent. The air conditioning hummed, a low drone that sounded like a warning. Thandiwe felt the walls closing in. She had found her daughter only to be told that claiming her would destroy her. She is stateless in the eyes of the truth, Chai concluded brutally. And she is property in the eyes of the lie. There is no middle ground. Sun-jun finally moved. The leather of his chair creaked as he leaned forward, drawing every eye in the room. The legal wall is unclimbable, he stated, his voice flat. So we do not climb it. He looked at Thandiwe, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Mr. Chai has outlined two viable options. 1. We erase you. New identity, new face, a one-way ticket to a country with no extradition treaties. You disappear, and I raise her alone. Thandiwe shook her head immediately. No. 2, Sun-jun continued, the word hanging heavy in the air. We merge the lie with the truth. He stood up, walking to the window to look out at his city, a city he controlled with violence, now forcing him to use a different kind of power. You become Mrs. Kwan, he said, watching her reflection in the glass. Marriage makes you her legal stepmother. It grants you residency. It closes the file. If you are my wife, no judge will question why you are raising my daughter. You hide in plain sight, protected by my name. Thandiwe stared at his back. It wasn't a proposal of love, it was a tactical maneuver. A merger. But as she thought of Christabel sleeping safely in the nursery, she knew it was the only way to keep the wolves at the door. The wedding, Sun-jun said to the reflection, will be this weekend. The Sunday afternoon sun felt like a lie, warming the pavement of the secluded Cheongdam-dong street where Sun-jun had foolishly allowed a moment of normalcy. They had just left a private tailor, fitting Christabel for a flower girl dress she would wear to a wedding that was nothing more than a legal maneuver. For 10 minutes, the Dragon of Seoul had walked without his detail right on his heels, watching Thandiwe wipe gelato from his daughter's chin. Then the air changed. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in pressure, the way birds suddenly scattered from the telephone wires. Sun-jun's hand went to his holster instinctively, his eyes snapping from Christabel's smile to the black sedan idling too long at the corner. Get down, he commanded, but the warning came a split second too late. A motorcycle mounted the curb, engine screaming like a banshee. The passenger raised a submachine gun. The first spray of bullets shattered the storefront window beside them, raining glass like diamonds. Sun-jun moved to cover them, drawing his weapon, but he was on the wrong side of the angle. He was the target, drawing the fire away, but the spray was wide, reckless. Christabel, he roared, firing 2 precise shots that sparked off the bike's fuel tank. He turned, expecting to see his daughter frozen in terror, exposed. Instead, he saw Thandiwe. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't cowered. In the fraction of a second when violence erupted, the waitress who had trembled in his office moved with the ferocity of a soldier. She had tackled Christabel, throwing her own body over the child's small frame behind a stone planter. Sun-jun didn't hesitate. He stepped into the open, embracing the danger to draw the shooter's eye. He fired 3 times, chest, neck, tire. The motorcycle skidded sideways, crashing into a parked car with a sickening crunch of metal. Silence rushed back in, ringing in his ears. Sun-jun didn't check the bodies. He holstered his weapon and ran to the planter, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way no turf war had ever caused. Thandiwe? She was curled around Christabel like a shield, her back exposed to the street. Slowly, she lifted her head. There was a graze on her cheek from flying concrete, bleeding sluggishly, but her eyes were dry and furious. Beneath her, Christabel was crying softly, unharmed, clutching Thandiwe's shirt. Thandiwe checked the child's limbs, her hands shaking only now that the danger had passed. She looked up at Sun-jun, and for the first time, she didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with expectation. "Is it over?" she demanded, her voice steel. Sun-jun stared at her. He saw the blood on her cheek, the dust on her knees, and the absolute refusal to let death touch his daughter. In that moment, the strategic necessity of their marriage evaporated. He wasn't looking at a liability. He was looking at a queen who had just earned her crown in the only currency that mattered to him, loyalty. He reached down, not to pull her up, but to wipe the blood from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was electric, lingering a second too long. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "It is over. I have you." Sun-jun stood alone in his study, the room plunged in darkness save for the cold, blue glow of the security monitors. On the screen, the afternoon's nightmare played out in a silent, agonizing loop. Frame by frame, he watched the motorcycle mount the curb. He watched the muzzle flash. He watched the glass shatter. But his eyes kept returning to the same split second, the moment Thandiwe threw herself over his daughter. He froze the image. There was no hesitation in her movement, no calculation of survival odds. She had offered her life for Christabel's without a thought, doing what his millions in security systems and armed guards had failed to do. He took a sip of whiskey, the burn doing nothing to settle the cold knot of dread in his stomach. Today was not a warning, it was a prologue. The shooters were sloppy, desperate amateurs hired by someone who wanted to send a message. And the message was clear: the dragon is distracted. The dragon is vulnerable. Sun-jun looked down at his hands. For 20 years, he had believed that power was safety. He had built the Geum-Ryong syndicate into an empire of fear, convinced that if he was the most dangerous thing in the dark, nothing could touch him. He was wrong. His power was not a shield, it was a beacon. Every territory he held, every rival he crushed, every dollar he laundered, it all painted a target on the back of the toddler sleeping down the hall. As long as he sat on the throne, Christabel would be a princess in a tower under siege. And Thandiwe would be collateral damage in a war she never asked to join. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He could kill the shooters. He could flay the men who hired them. He could burn down rival gangs until the streets ran red. But it wouldn't stop. There would always be another viper, another rival, another bullet. The rot was in the foundation. Sun-jun set the glass down with a heavy clink. He turned away from the screens and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling metropolis of Seoul, the kingdom he had conquered with blood and iron. He had promised Thandiwe protection. He had promised to fix his daughter. He could not keep those promises as the boss of the Geum-Ryong. He reached for the secure phone on his desk, the one that connected directly to his offshore bankers and data archivists. The decision settled over him, calm and absolute. He would not just abdicate. He would not just run. To save the life he was building inside these walls, he had to destroy the life he had built outside of them. The dragon had to die so the father could live. "Prepare the eclipse protocols," he whispered into the receiver, his voice steady. "We are liquidating everything." The vault beneath the penthouse was no longer a tomb for secrets, it was a war room. The air hummed with the sound of cooling fans from the server banks lining the walls, the digital heart of the Geum-Ryong syndicate. Sun-jun sat at the steel terminal, his tie discarded, sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink on his forearms. Thandiwe stood beside him, watching the screen where streams of data cascaded like rain. "This is everything," Sun-jun said, his voice stripped of emotion. 20 years of leverage. Judges, senators, police chiefs. The invisible strings that make me the dragon. He hovered his finger over the enter key. "And we are cutting them. If you delete the blackmail files, you lose your protection," Thandiwe whispered, understanding the terrifying mechanics of his world now. "They won't fear you anymore." "That is the point," Sun-jun replied. He pressed the key. A progress bar appeared, purging. Fear is a currency I can no longer afford to hold. It attracts thieves. Thandiwe watched as names and dossiers, people who could ruin lives with a phone call, vanished into the digital void. It was an act of suicide for the syndicate boss, but an act of liberation for the father. Next, the assets, Sun-jun said, typing a complex string of code. I am moving the liquid capital through shell companies in the Caymans, then Singapore, then finally to untraceable accounts in the Seychelles. The physical assets, the clubs, the shipping containers, the warehouses, will be seized by the state when I leak the locations anonymously tomorrow morning. Thandiwe leaned closer, her hand resting on the back of his chair. You're burning billions. It's blood money, Thandiwe. It buys nothing but targets. He looked up at her, his dark eyes intense. I am keeping enough for us. Enough to disappear. Enough for Christabel to never know hunger or fear. The rest, let the vultures fight over the carcass. He pulled a sleek, black drive from the terminal and held it out to her. This contains the new identities. Passports, birth certificates, medical records. We leave in 48 hours. A private flight to Manila, then a boat to an island where the name Kwan means nothing. Thandiwe took the drive. It felt light, insignificant, yet it held their entire future. She looked at the man who was dismantling an empire with the same precision he used to build it. She saw the exhaustion in the lines of his face, but also a strange, new lightness. Are you sure? She asked, her voice steady. Once we leave this room, the dragon is dead. Sun-jun reached out, covering her hand with his own. His skin was warm against hers. The dragon was a role I played to survive, he said softly. You and Christabel, you are the life I want to live. He turned back to the screen, where the final transfer was blinking green. Operation Eclipse is active. The sun is setting on the Geum-Ryong. The suitcase on the bed was half full, a pathetic summary of a life being left behind. Thandiwe folded a small pink sweater, her movements jerky and fast. Beside her, Sun-jun checked the magazine of his pistol for the third time, the glow of the Eclipse progress bar on his phone reflecting in his dark eyes. 90%, he murmured. Once it hits 100, the accounts vanish. It feels too easy, Thandiwe whispered, placing Christabel's worn rabbit doll on top of the clothes. It isn't. Sun-jun holstered the weapon. The hard part is surviving the exit. As if summoned by his words, the phone screen in his hand turned a violent crimson. Access denied. System override. Sun-jun froze. The air in the penthouse shifted, the pressurized silence of the high-rise instantly replaced by the hum of a threat. He looked at the security monitor on the wall. The camera feeds from the lobby, the garage, and the elevator were gone, replaced by a static gray loop. They know, Sun-jun said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. Get Christabel. Go to the safe room. Now. Sun-jun. Go. Thandiwe ran toward the nursery, but the elevator chime echoed through the vast apartment before she reached the hall. It wasn't the service lift, it was the private express elevator that only Sun-jun could access. The door slid open. Minho stood there, impeccable in a charcoal suit, flanked not by enemies, but by the very men Sun-jun paid to protect his home. The Viper held a tablet in one hand and a suppressed pistol in the other. You really thought you could just hit delete? Minho asked, stepping onto the marble floor. His voice echoed in the cavernous foyer. You thought you could take the money, the power, and the air, and just walk away to play house? Sun-jun stepped out from the bedroom, placing himself between the intruders and the hallway leading to his family. This is between us, Minho. Let them leave. There is no us anymore, brother, Minho sneered, tossing the tablet onto a side table. It showed the aborted deletion sequence. You chose the outsider. You chose the weakness. Now, I have to choose the syndicate. He raised the gun. Kill the dragon. Keep the girl. The woman is expendable. The betrayal didn't sting, it severed. Sun-jun didn't wait for them to fire. He kicked the heavy oak table over as a shield just as the room exploded in a hail of gunfire, bullets shattering the Ming vases and shredding the silk curtains. He returned fire, dropping one traitor, but there were too many. He was pinned down in his own castle, and the wolves were already inside. The penthouse was no longer a home, it was a kill box. Sun-jun moved through the wreckage of the living room, sliding across marble slick with blood and shattered crystal. His gun clicked empty. He cursed, discarding the weapon and drawing the knife concealed at his belt just as a shadow lunged from the smoke. It was Kong, a man Sun-jun had pulled from the gutters of Busan and raised like a younger brother. Kong swung a baton with lethal force, his face twisted in a mask of apologetic violence. Sun-jun blocked the strike with his forearm, the bone shuddering, and drove his knee into Kang's gut. There was no hesitation, no mercy. The Brotherhood had died the moment the first bullet was fired. Sun-jun slammed Kang's head into the wall, the sickening crack lost in the cacophony of gunfire from the hallway. Thandiwe! Sun-jun roared, scrambling over the debris toward the master bedroom. Inside, Thandiwe had shoved the heavy oak dresser against the door, but the wood was splintering under the assault of heavy boots. She dragged Christabel into the walk-in closet, burying the sobbing child beneath a pile of Sun-jun's silk suits. Stay down, Thandiwe whispered, her voice trembling. Cover your ears, baby. Close your eyes. She grabbed the backup pistol Sun-jun had left on the nightstand. It felt alien in her hand, heavy, cold, evil. She had never fired a gun. She poured wine. She folded napkins. She did not kill. The bedroom door gave way with a crash. A gunman stepped over the ruined dresser, scanning the room. He wasn't Minho, he was a faceless soldier, a hired gun who saw only a target. He saw the movement in the closet. He raised his weapon, aiming not at Thandiwe, but low, toward the floor where Christabel lay hidden. No. Thandiwe didn't think. The waitress vanished, replaced by the mother. She stepped out from the closet, raising the gun with both hands. She didn't aim, she simply pointed at the threat to her child and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly broke her wrist. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the gunman in the throat. He dropped without a sound, choking on his own blood. Thandiwe stared at him, the gun shaking violently in her grip, the smell of cordite stinging her nose. She had taken a life. The horror of it washed over her, freezing her lungs. Sun-jun burst into the room a second later, blood smeared across his white shirt, a fresh cut bleeding above his eye. He saw the dead man. He saw Thandiwe standing over him, the smoking gun still raised. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing the gun from her numb fingers and pulling her against his chest. Breathe, he commanded, his voice rough against her ear. You did what you had to do. You saved her. I killed him, she gasped, her eyes wide and unseeing. You protected us, Sun-jun corrected fiercely. He looked at the door. The firing had stopped, replaced by the ominous sound of heavy footsteps surrounding their position. They were backed into the furthest corner of the apartment. There was no way out. They are regrouping, Sun-jun said, looking at the window, then at the bottle of high-proof whiskey on the dresser and his lighter. We cannot fight them all. We have to burn them out. The lighter in Sun-jun's hand was a cheap plastic thing, the only object in the penthouse that didn't cost a fortune. He looked at the whiskey-soaked drapes, the spilled alcohol pooling around the antique furniture, the kindling for his funeral pyre. Go to the roof, Sun-jun commanded, shoving Thandiwe toward the service stairwell concealed behind the paneling. The pilot is waiting. Do not look back. He flicked the wheel. The spark caught the fumes instantly. A wall of blue and orange flame roared to life, devouring the silk and mahogany with a hunger that matched his own. The heat was immediate, blistering the skin, turning the air into smoke and ash. It wasn't just arson, it was an exorcism. The dragon was burning his cave. Sun-jun. Thandiwe screamed, coughing as the smoke thickened. Go. She scrambled into the dark stairwell. Christabel clung to her chest, her face buried in Thandiwe's neck. Sun-jun slammed the panel shut, sealing them away from the inferno, and turned to face the main doors. They blew open a second later. Minho stepped through the wall of smoke like a demon, his suit singed, his eyes watering but manic with rage. He saw the fire consuming the legacy of the Geum-Ryong, the melting art, the blackening gold. You are insane. The Viper screamed, raising his gun. You burn it all for her? Sun-jun didn't speak. He grabbed a heavy marble bust from a pedestal and hurled it. Minho fired blindly, the bullet going wide as the statue smashed into his shoulder, knocking the gun into the flames. Sun-jun charged. He tackled his brother into the burning living room. They crashed onto the floor, rolling through glass and embers. This wasn't the clean, martial arts sparring of their youth. It was a brawl. Minho clawed at Sun-jun's throat, his thumbs digging into the windpipe. Sun-jun gasped, the smoke filling his lungs, his vision swimming. You were a god. Minho spat, his face twisted by the heat. And you chose to be a peasant. Sun-jun felt the edge of a shattered table against his hand. He gripped a shard of glass. I chose to be a father. He drove the glass into Minho's side. The Viper howled, his grip loosening. Sun-jun threw him off, staggering to his feet. The ceiling groaned, the support beams buckling under the heat. The penthouse was disintegrating. Minho tried to rise, blood soaking his shirt, the flames circling him. He looked at Sun-jun with hatred that was rapidly turning to fear. You die here too, brother. No, Sun-jun said, backing toward the terrace doors where the wind whipped the flames into a frenzy. The dragon dies here. Sun-jun Kwan leaves. He turned and sprinted through the shattered glass doors, the heat of the explosion throwing him forward just as the roof collapsed inward, burying the Viper and the throne of the Geum-Ryong in a tomb of fire. Above the roar of the blaze, he heard the thwop-thwop-thwop of rotors cutting the air. He wasn't running from the fire anymore. He was running toward the only thing that mattered. The scar on his shoulder was a jagged map of the night the world burned, a souvenir from the glass shard that had ended his brother's life. But here, under the relentless sun of the Palawan coast, it was just old skin. Sun-jun sat on the white sand, wearing a loose linen shirt that would have made the Dragon of Seoul scoff. His feet were bare, buried in the warmth, and for the first time in 40 years, his hands were empty. He watched the water. 50 yards out, the turquoise surf crashed against the legs of the two people who held his soul. Thandiwe was laughing, her hair loose and wild in the salt wind, chasing a squealing Christabel through the shallows. Catch me, Mama. Catch me. The sound of his daughter's voice, loud, demanding, and utterly fearless, still stopped his heart. 6 months ago, she had been a ghost haunting his hallway, a porcelain doll terrified of her own existence. Now, she was a force of nature. Sun-jun took a sip of coconut water, a far cry from the scotch that used to numb his nights. He thought about the empire he had incinerated. The billions in assets, the armies of soldiers, the fear that had paved his way through life. It was all ash, drifting somewhere over the Han River. He checked his wrist out of habit, but there was no Patek Philippe, no secure comms link. Just a woven bracelet Christabel had made him from seashells. Thandiwe turned, shielding her eyes against the glare. She spotted him watching and waved, her smile brighter than the sun reflecting off the ocean. Sun-jun. Come in. The water is perfect. He stood up, his joints protesting slightly from the old injuries, but his movement was light. He walked down to the water's edge, leaving the ghost of the dragon behind in the sand. When he reached them, Thandiwe splashed him, and Christabel launched herself into his arms, wet and sandy and smelling of life. He caught her easily, pressing a kiss to her forehead while reaching out to pull Thandiwe close. As the waves washed over their feet, washing away the last traces of the onyx room and the fire, Sun-jun looked at the woman who had saved him and the daughter who finally had a voice. He had lost a kingdom, yes. But standing there, holding his world in his arms, he knew the truth. He was richer now than he had ever been. If this story of redemption and sacrifice moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives. What would you sacrifice for your family? Let us know in the comments below.